Performance can be thrilling. It can be rewarding, all-encompassing, sometimes terrifying, damaging, vomit-inducing, a permanent scar on your nervous system, a literal scar from a stress rash you got after one performance as a child. Imagine the audience naked. Imagine nobody's there at all. Don't make eye contact. Fixate on one person. Fixate on the clock on the back wall. Adjust the piano stool before you go on stage. Remember to breathe. If you take painkillers, then your hands won't shake. All of this, and then the moment arrives. You step into the spotlight, and everything leaves your brain. Your subconscious has left the building. It's just you. And after the panic and preparation, you pray to God that there's space left in your brain to actually remember how to do the thing you're about to do on stage. But fuck it, it's fun, right? We loved Whiplash, Black Swan, Birdman, and La La Land. We loved the thrill of seeing someone crumble under the pressure and despite that, achieving their full potential, whatever the cost. Maybe it's because we're all a bit sadistic, or because we're really entrenched in these ideas that destroying ourselves through our work will somehow set us free and enrich our life in a meaningful way. But either way, it feels gratifying and inspiring to watch people do what they love, losing themselves in their craft. However, we're not limited to one aspect of performance in film. We're most familiar with artistic performance, the pursuit of creative perfection and fulfillment through dance, through music, acting, and filmmaking. But when I looked at this idea more closely, I noticed some other categories of performance. In films like Cleo from 5 to 7 and Titan, we see this exploration of gender performance. In a more specific lens of artistic performance, we explored self-destructive performance. We love this genre a little bit too much, because we're all capitalist rats and we love when addiction and toxic work habits are conflated with passion. And then we have films about performing and the male ego in crisis, which we see in 8 Half, Pain and Glory, Birdman, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. This also extends to the less explicit representations of this in A Bigger Splash, American Psycho, La Dolce Vita, The Swimmer, as they perform heightened versions of themselves. However, I think there's one film that doesn't fit into any of these categories, a film that blurs the line between life and performance. I don't think anything captures what it's like to be a performer as well as the opening scene of All That Jazz. Joe Gideon is a force to be reckoned with. He's magnetic, charismatic, and the type of person who makes everyone feel special just by speaking to you. But in the same way, it makes the people he loves feel distinctly unspecial and starved of his affection. But on the stage, that doesn't matter. Who he is privately and publicly all melts away, and everywhere he goes, he's switched on and performing. To the dancers, casting directors, his girlfriends, yes, plural, the financiers, the audience members. But what happens to someone who's constantly living in the limelight? In Irving Goffman's book, The Performance of Self in Everyday Life, he writes about the concept of dramaturgy and how life is like a play, and when we're born, we become actors on this stage of life. Our socialization consists of learning how to play our assigned roles from other people. He distinguished between front and back stages and the different types of performance in both spaces. Backstage being our more private, intimate selves, and the front stage self being who you are at work or a party. All That Jazz exposed something new within performance. Joe Gideon is constantly switched on. He's never not performing. To him, there was no back and main stage. Everywhere was a new stage to be performed on, another opportunity to present himself and win the adoration of the people who looked up to him. The reality of his life was obscured by the fantasies of his constant performance. He was a bad father, an even worse partner, his health was rapidly declining, and his ego was in crisis after one bad review. But performance is the ultimate tonic. Elena on Letterboxd said, "There's a kind of surface-level love that exists within entertainment, some mix of adoration and deification, and it's fucking addictive. To feel it, you have to perform. But the frivolous love that's delivered through laudation can't stand on its own, and stimulants to fill those gaps, to keep the performance going, become commonplace. I'm not sure I've ever seen a film portray that bright, disillusioned side of entertainment quite as brilliantly as All That Jazz. As the scenes grow more feverish, so does the glamour attempting to conceal such devastating disorientation. But the reason why this film doesn't fit into any of the categories I just mentioned is because of one reason: this photo. Joe Gideon was based on a real person, Bob Fosse, who directed the film. The entire film is a narrativization of his own life and his own shortcomings, insecurities, and experiences as someone in the entertainment industry. The film isn't just about the ego crisis of a fictional character. It's not just about the inherent self-destructiveness of being a performer. It's a very real and vulnerable look at a real person who was revered within the industry, Someone who is making a statement about the pedestals we create for famous people and the dangers of performance. Someone who became so disillusioned by performance that they ultimately died as a result of their addiction to being seen. But beneath the glitter and glamour of all that jazz, there's a much darker message, one that seems to have been ignored and misunderstood as our idea of performance has continued to evolve in even more damaging ways that Bob Fosse tried to warn us about through Joe Gideon. As we've created more ways to share our lives, the idea of performing has extended to non-professional performers, to the everyday person. With the rise of celebrity and internet culture, both stages that Goffman talked about have somewhat combined. A new category of performance has been created, one that is symbolic of a much deeper sociological shift. When did we destroy the line between life and performance? And why are we so addicted to performing? Welcome back to Pompous Unhelpful Knit and my deep dive into the plight of the performer. Before 2017, I don't remember any conversations being had about mental health and vulnerability. I think we covered eating disorders in school and maybe depression, but that was painted as either being a girl's disease or something that Stephen Fry had in the 90s. I vaguely knew what anxiety was because of the infamous Suella video from 2012, but besides that, there really wasn't much to go on. During the third season of Love Island in 2017, I remember a small shift in the mainstream conversations around men's mental health. Chris Hughes was a very likeable and funny part of this season, but what I think made him interesting was his candidness about how he felt and ability to be vulnerable and draw out vulnerability from the other islanders. After the show finished, he collaborated with Topshop and Calm for a campaign called Don't Bottle It Up, where bottled water was sold that was supposedly infused with his tears. It sounds ridiculous, but it really sparked a conversation on the internet that I'd never seen before, and I'm sure there were many other things that propelled this conversation forward, but after this point, things seemed to change quite radically. The people that did talk about their experiences with mental health, specifically on the internet, were praised for being authentic, vulnerable, and most importantly, real. People started to talk about the impact of social media around the same time, focusing on the disparity between what we see online and realities that we don't see. Zoella would post a vlog of her book launch and then contrast it with a segment of her crying because of how anxious she felt. Certain models would post pictures of themselves looking great and then be labelled as being brave for posting a less staged and flattering photo. There were some people that were actually being radical for their vulnerability online, which was recognised and praised by many people on the internet. However, with this, there comes a catch, because after all, it's still the internet and many people are not motivated by the intentions of something, but by how it looks, and more specifically, the attention they'll receive. Where there's praise and validation, people will follow the cause. And thus, we have the creation of a new loophole within late-stage capitalism, which I call the vulnerability market. We quickly saw that vulnerability sells. People noticed that authenticity was seen as desirable, something that was being rewarded. It became the new cool thing to do. But the thing about vulnerability and being unapologetically yourself is that it's not an easy thing to do. But because people on the internet were becoming famous for this, others quickly realised that this was something to be capitalised. And here we see a new type of performance, with people performing authenticity and vulnerability, on and offline. We see this through people either copying traits from people who have already been publicly validated for being themselves, or through people performing vulnerability online to fit into the new bracket of cool, which now valued being real. This quickly evolved into these trends of people either sharing too much or exploiting other people's vulnerability for views. People have conflated talking about vulnerable subjects with being vulnerable, which we know isn't the same thing. Now that people have realised that these qualities are marketable, the idea of performing has seeped into our everyday lives in a much bigger way. We want people to think we're being honest without actually being honest. We want people to think we're being ourselves when we're just pretending to be someone else that people admire. And this is where things get confusing. Are people motivated by being themselves, or are they motivated by the praise they want to receive for authenticity and the pedestal that's given to those that rise above the non-realness of social media? Let's look at some examples. Everyone's familiar with the quote, "Dance like nobody's watching." We get the basic sentiment of it, I don't need to explain it. But in certain spaces, this idea has now evolved into act as if you're dancing like nobody's watching. We're trying to detach ourselves from the performance of social media and prove our authenticity, all whilst recording and sharing ourselves, and then acting as if our performance is a result of how free, authentic and unbothered we are about being perceived, which only proves our dependence on performing and being perceived in the first place. In Moya Lothian McLean's article, she wrote, Young women desperate to stand out from the crowd were coaxed into sharing intimate and often traumatic details about their lives for clicks. In this arena, to lay yourself bare was an act of ambition. Meanwhile, a new crop of digital-first and reality TV celebrities had emerged, defined by their authenticity and willingness to present their entire existence for public consumption. One thing I think that highlights this is the emergence of main character syndrome, which I think was created as a response to audiences seeing authentic people receiving attention for being and living for themselves. People who were doing their own thing and seemed unbothered by what people thought about them. And this created this weird kind of narcissistic trend of people behaving in the same way, but not necessarily being unbothered by people's perception of them. The idea evolved into wanting people to know that they're the main character, to make people aware of their existence, that everyone else is just an accessory to their life. They'll do their own thing because they're the main character, but everyone needs to know about it. By performing authenticity online for the sake of external validation and creating more ways to share our lives, we've merged together our inner and outer worlds. The idea of a private space or thought doesn't really exist anymore, because some people want to share everything. This idea that our lives only matter if we're processing it through the eyes of other people, through an audience. And if we behave with the intention of sharing ourselves and sharing more of ourselves when it isn't natural or comfortable to do so, then it ultimately creates a performance. Maybe Instagram was just supposed to be a silly platform where you post nice pictures of yourself. Maybe we shouldn't give weight to every thought we have. Maybe we're allowed privacy in our struggles and the reality of our lives. Maybe we've placed too much importance on our individual existence that we've become too aware of ourselves, that we've lost our ability to build community and really listen to other people. Some of us are too concerned about people knowing that we're taking up space. At one extreme, we find that the performer can be fully taken in by his own act. He can be sincerely convinced that the impression of reality which he stages is the real reality, when his audience is also convinced in this way about the show he puts on, and this seems to be the typical case, then for the moment, anyway, only the sociologist or the socially disgruntled will have any doubts about the realness of what is presented. I think we've started to see this in an interesting way through the way people talk about their romantic relationships online as well. Imagine this, you're in a relationship, it's a Sunday morning and you're lying in bed with your significant other. You're both on your phones scrolling TikTok in silence. Then one of you hears a soundbite that's relevant to being in love. So you tell your significant other the words or lyrics, you decide on the blocking for the TikTok, and then you film something like this. You post it and everyone comments on how jealous they are of you. You're the perfect couple. Now really think about these videos I know we've all seen. The reality of it is, one person sets up the camera, you awkwardly perform your love for each other in an extremely heightened and unnatural way, spinning each other around and kissing while some non-copyrighted Ella Fitzgerald song plays. And then you stop recording. You stop with the extreme PDA and watch back the video to make sure it's just enviable enough for 14-year-olds to think that this is what relationships are really like.
Again.
Call me cold-hearted, but why are people commodifying their relationships? Sorry, that did come across really cold-hearted of me. I swear I'm not a complete, piece of ice. Arguably, we're most vulnerable in romantic relationships, and within the vulnerability market, this is extremely valuable. The idea of someone being chosen, to be loved by someone, to be someone's person in this life, is a really lovely idea. And under the internet, something that should be mined for profit and exploited to I particularly noticed this with the idea of soft and hard launching relationships. Before this was a named phenomenon, it was a nice idea. You see a picture on Instagram with 2 coffee cups, not one, and you're like, ooh, I wonder who they're with. Or you see a picture of another shadow on a beach and you think, oh, could this be love? It's exciting. But then we named it and made it a thing, and some people took it way too far. I saw a TikTok the other day on photo ideas for soft launching your partner, and I lost my mind. Do you want to be in a relationship, or do you just want people to know you're in a relationship and that you're validated by someone? For some, even love has become performative, and the aesthetic of being in a relationship has been commercialized. I would argue that this is also a response to the online idea of living your life as a movie, which exists somewhere between romanticizing your life and exaggerating the reality of your experiences. With the encouragement of narrativizing our lives and living them as movies, it means that some are portraying these hyper-exaggerated and weirdly clinical versions of their day-to-day experiences. But the whole point about movies is that they're not real and they don't depict the full range of human emotions and experiences. Does replicating the movie experience in everyday life detach us further from authenticity and living presently? I'm not saying that life can't be similar to these experiences that we see in the movies, sometimes they are, but by applying this idea to everyday life, I think we've just created another way of performing. Our experiences inevitably won't live up to this fantasy, and when the rose-coloured bubble bursts and we realise that relationships are hard work, what happens then? Are we setting ourselves up for failure by expecting the heightened and narrativized portrayals of love that we see online? Ultimately, our participation in these trends is a side effect of being presented with this technology, which ultimately leaves us feeling insignificant and quite insecure. Whilst we may add to these problems by taking part, I do understand why it's become a crutch for our insecurities and a way of patching up the parts of ourselves that we feel are inadequate. However, overcompensating for our insecurities by oversharing other parts of our lives or pretending to share our vulnerabilities is not a solution, and there are some groups of people that are impacted by these trends in a different way to the average everyday person. People that are already expected to share far too much of their lives. And this leads me on to my next chapter.
I can't help noticing that a lot of your face is not injured.
Where are you going with this, Graham?
Actually, no, that's not the truth, Ellen. You were invited.
When will you wear wigs?
Celebrity interviews, we all watch them. There are some great ones, a simple format for harmless and entertaining fun, and some that are not so much that.
Are you supposed to be in rehab now?
Over the last 20 years or so, the ways that we market films have become reliant on actors and filmmakers being able to discuss their creative process as a way of selling their work. We've seen hundreds of press junket interviews and talk show segments filled with behind-the-scenes stories, photos on set, first audition tapes, and the same questions being asked over and over again. What was it like on set? What was it like working with your co-star? Recently, my friend told me this anecdote about how worms do not have the ability to perceive light. We know what light is. It's not difficult to describe to someone who can see it, but it's difficult to imagine trying to explain the concept of light to a worm. I was thinking about this in relation to people who try to describe the creative process. Making a film with a group of people is like an inside joke. You can't really explain it to people that weren't there. And discussions about the creative process weren't previously expected of performers. There used to be a certain element of secrecy around filmmaking. People would make a movie in the middle of the desert, release it to the public, and never talk about it again. No podcast appearances, TikTok campaigns, or BuzzFeed interviews with puppies. Walter Davis described art as the public airing of secrets. But what about the public airing of the creative process? What effect does this have on the work and the performers? The release of Apocalypse Now was accompanied by an insane amount of coverage on the filmmaking process. A book was written about it, a documentary was made, not to mention the countless news stories and articles about the happenings on set. And here's a question. Is it a good film, or have we just become so familiar with the challenges of the creative process that we've conflated the struggles of making it with the quality of the film? And this got me thinking, does knowing too much about the creative process distort the way we treat the work? If this film had been released with no insight into the shit show behind the scenes, I doubt that it would be viewed the way it is today. But because of this insight, it gave the film a pedestal, and it evolved into the film equivalent of a martyr, the story of the filmmaker who sacrificed everything for his, I would say questionable, vision. I feel that maybe the same thing happened with Barbenheimer. We became so excited for this event, yes, because of the directors involved, but I would argue also because of the behind-the-scenes stories and insights we gathered about the creative process whilst it was being made. Margot Robbie's infamous letterbox leak of Gerwig's references for Barbie, the article about Nolan setting off a real bomb, the stories of the pink paint shortage, and the endless memes about Cillian Murphy's dedication to his performance. Naturally, the way we market art and performance has changed under capitalism. This is nothing new, and something I've discussed in depth in other videos. And in terms of the impact on the work itself, it's fairly harmless. We just have a heightened sense of awareness around the people involved, and because there are more platforms to share information, we know more about the creative process. However, the effect of all of this is very different for those behind and in front of the camera. Actors and filmmakers are now expected to give more of themselves to these processes in order to sell their work and comply with the new market of vulnerability. For filmmakers, this can be great. More people are aware of your work. Outside of your marketing team, there are people promoting your work on social media without even realizing it, and there are new platforms for writers and directors to discuss their work in a nuanced way, with audiences that are genuinely interested in what they have to say. But because performers are more present in the public eye than writers or directors, and are already expected to share so much of themselves in their work, this has a different effect on them.
Sometimes, but it was more personal.
It was.
Yeah, I like to keep it for myself. It's like a personal expression. I didn't need kind of adoration. I didn't need people to validate me. It's just something that I felt inside and expressed it.
Just you and a piece of cardboard in your room.
I'm making fun of it, but it was pretty serious for me.
How much weight have you lost to get into this shape right now?
You did not just ask me that
No, I'm
question.
just saying, you're like...
Life, and I'm looking forward to actually just taking time for me.
That's a tremendous outfit, and the reason that's a tremendous outfit is you have tremendous legs. Fantastic legs.
Which song is about Zach on the new CD?
There's nothing really about Zach on the CD because we didn't date.
All right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
At the heart of creativity is vulnerability, and there's something very jarring about discussing self-expression and the process of being vulnerable in clinical, invulnerable settings. You might argue that learning more about these celebrities and their creative process makes them less mysterious and more relatable to the everyday person. To an extent, yes, it does add an element of connection and a common point we can relate to. But if we're always hearing about these people in relation to their work, it almost commodifies them and means that they're treated as if they're adverts or products, not people.
A ton about you personally. Is that intentional?
I don't know a lot about you.
They're being seen too much to the point that they're unseen. We're familiar with their image, but not who they are underneath. They exist somewhere between being a god and an object, which is ultimately dehumanizing. And this is where things get tricky, because it opens up a whole new area within the vulnerability market that is being capitalized on. Because more and more people have access to performers in their lives, it means they're almost left with no choice but to participate in this market in order to be humanized. That by sharing more of themselves and being more vulnerable, people would sympathize with them and see them as people, and not just performers. And here's my question. Will people ever see vulnerability as something that humanizes famous people? Or is it seen as another performance? Does it just exploit them even further and blur the lines between their private and public lives? Here's an example. I've recently noticed a rise in long-form celebrity interviews, where they're given an opportunity to speak candidly about their struggles and real experiences. On shows like the Call Her Daddy podcast, Stephen Bartlett's Making of a Millionaire, they're advertised as platforms that allow famous people to reveal all, clear up any public indiscrepancies, rumours, and talk about whatever they want. No agenda. And I'm not a famous person, I'm sure this is very freeing and cathartic for some, but I've noticed a few things that make me feel a bit uneasy about this. There's an inherent power imbalance within this exchange. Whilst the guests on the show may see this as an opportunity to share who they really are, feel seen, and garner public sympathy for the challenges of being in the public eye, the audience won't necessarily see it the same way. To them, it's just a way to find out more personal information about the famous person, an all-access pass to their personal life under the guise of transparency and open conversation. They're just excited to be privy to more information about this person, which further breaches that line between their inner and outer world. It's always presented as a chance for them to tell their truth, but the public often conflates the truth with gossip. To them, it's just another headline and something to be commodified. These interviews naturally make their struggles more public, and when certain people know your weaknesses, it makes you more vulnerable, which isn't always treated kindly by the public or press. These types of interviews have also evolved by centering around increasingly difficult subject matter. Call Her Daddy was initially a podcast about sexual empowerment and non-famous women talking about their dating experiences. But then, I'm assuming that they realised that what would sell even better than women talking about their sex lives was famous women talking about their sex lives. And then this evolved into famous people in general talking about not sex, but trauma. In order to be humanised, it seems as though some celebrities feel like they have to share more, that they can only be given a shred of sympathy and kindness if they open up about their very worst experiences. We expect openness from famous people as if they owe us these private details of their lives, that we deserve explanations for breakups, family conflicts, or unclear news stories from the past. Ordinary people don't typically show this level of vulnerability publicly, and we're not expected to go around revealing the worst things that have ever happened to us. But we almost expect this extreme vulnerability from those in the public eye, from those that are already sharing so much of themselves in their creative work. Perhaps the better way to humanize yourself as a celebrity is to detach yourself from your image. For example, Emma Stone, a very successful and famous actress, but I would argue that because we see less of her on social media and her public appearances are fairly limited, she's more rooted in reality because she's detached from her presence on screen. Whereas with someone like Kylie Jenner, who's constantly tied to her online presence, she can't detach herself from this public image because she seemingly exists in more public than private spaces. I'm not saying that famous people shouldn't take part in these things for fear of dehumanization, but I can imagine that having these things removes that degree of separation between your work and private life. A quick side note, I wanted to say that I don't disagree with people choosing to share their experiences and like be vulnerable on podcasts and interviews and all this kind of stuff. I think it's like a really brave and like really lovely thing to do. But my point is, are they going to see it as like a beautiful, brave thing, or are they just going to see it as something that can be exploited? And it's almost like we've done a 360 and people in the public eye are thinking, oh, okay, instead of the press hounding me for information about my life, I'll just volunteer it first. And then it's like I'm taking back control. But I'm just kind of questioning whether that's still you having control over your life if you feel like you have to share information in order to be humanized, in order to be like treated, you know, respectfully like a person. We shouldn't have to know every intricate detail about someone's personal life in order for us to treat them with a shred of dignity and respect and allow them to have privacy over their struggles. And I just feel like that's kind of a scary place to be, and it shows that we're quite detached from all people and being empathetic if we feel like we can only treat people well if we know everything about them and why they act the way they do. Like, why can't we just walk around expecting that everyone has their own messy lives and that we should just treat everyone kindly regardless of what we do and don't know? However, people are generally less invasive about the private lives and public appearance of famous cis men, but I think we're starting to see some resistance to these expectations from some famous women, who are interestingly using their image in an opposite way to take back control. At the recent Met Ball, Doja Cat dressed up as a cat. I'm aware that she was dressing up as Karl Lagerfeld's cat, but if I link back to my earlier point about celebrities being seen as something between God and an object, then I think it's very interesting that she chose to dress as an animal. Not only this, but she refused to speak, only responding as a cat. I have no idea if this was deliberate, but it's an interesting commentary on the way that she's viewed as a famous person. She's so detached from this normal human status that she isn't really seen as a person. She's part of this elusive in-between grey area. But she's recently made a few changes to her appearance and the way she presents herself publicly, which makes me feel as though it was intentional. When Doja Cat first became famous, she spoke about being objectified by the media and the sexualized comments made about her body. And over the past year, she's altered nearly every aspect of her appearance that was highlighted in the media, almost trying to make people dislike her appearance, reasserting control by not conforming to what's expected of her image as a woman in the public eye. Take this recent photo she posted on Instagram, the caption being "thirst trap," while she looks, in all honesty, quite scary. There have been other women in the public eye that have made similar choices, such as Billie Eilish, who famously only wore baggy clothes as a way of avoiding her body being publicly commented on, and Miley Cyrus, who tried to destroy her good Disney girl image by expressing her sexual identity. I noticed a similar thing recently with Florence Pugh, who shaved her head and started dressing in an edgier way. I think this is very interesting. These women were previously praised for their clean-cut, feminine conforming appearances, and have switched by presenting themselves in feminine, non-conforming ways. It's almost a way of testing this pedestal that they're on, a way of saying, do you still worship me now, even when I don't look the way you want me to look? So is that what celebrities are trying to do? Are they testing the vulnerability market by showing a side of themselves that makes people uncomfortable? Showing our vulnerabilities as everyday people was encouraged in an attempt to bring us closer together by showing the realities of our lives instead of the performative displays we'd see online. But it slowly evolved into another performance, perhaps an even more damaging one. The effect of this on famous people, however, is much more invasive, often leaving them more exposed than they were before and demanding more of their private selves, destroying the boundaries between their public and private lives. And this leads me back to Bob Fosse and to the film that reflects this very idea. However, I initially said that there was only one film that fits into this category, but there's actually two, which leads me onto our third and final chapter. Bo Burnham's anxieties around performing have been the focus of most of his work, whether in his comedy specials or his 2018 feature 8th Grade, which makes for an oddly uncomfortable viewing experience when you know that you are in some way a source of fear and validation. Similarly to Joe Gideon and All That Jazz, you never know when he's performing vulnerability, or being genuine. How do we know what's part of the show? All That Jazz was the first of its kind to blur the process of creation with the product of creativity itself, going against the unspoken rule at the time that we shouldn't share the process of creating, that it's a private part of being an artist that shouldn't be publicised. Bo Burnham explored this as a public issue by showing our unrealistic expectations for artists and what we expect from their work, all whilst revealing his creative processes and the pressure for him to live up to his own image. But Bob Fosse looked at these questions from a personal standpoint that then, I believe, evolved into a global issue. Through his characterisation of himself as Joe Gideon, we see the plight of being a performer and a new question. Is it the performance of a lifetime, or a performance that lasted a lifetime? Beneath the grit and grandeur of the entertainment industry, Fosse shows the audience how by placing him on this pedestal, he was never seen for who he really is. He tries to show the audience just how flawed and insecure he is, how constant praise and performance has disillusioned him to the point where he's ruled by his ego and what he creates. Over the course of the film, we slowly watch him coming to terms with his failures, not as an artist, but as a person. The performance was so all-consuming that he became detached from real life and the things that mattered, the relationships with the women in his life. My favourite scene from the whole film is when his daughter and girlfriend dance for him. It's such a pure and human moment where we see him registering that this is what a family could be like. We see him watch these two people that he's too scared to love fully, realising that he could have this closeness and other life with them, but he can't. His commitment to performance is so deep that he doesn't have the ability to be truly vulnerable anymore, to experience these moments of real human connection. The constant performance has corrupted his ability to love and exist genuinely. To him, none of it is real. And this is the real tragedy of all that jazz. Even the finale, overflowing with the flamboyance of Foss's oeuvre and the absurdity of performance, masks an immense darkness that perhaps wouldn't be there if there wasn't such disparity between love and saying I love you. We're all addicted to viewing ourselves through the lens of performance. As we create more public spaces to share our lives, we've diminished the importance of a private life, of solitude, reflection, not feeling as though we need to prove our existence and justify the space we occupy. We're filtering our lives through the idea that we're always being watched and perceived, and by doing that, it only makes it harder to be ourselves. Some people are so committed to the parts they're playing that they're unable to differentiate reality from the version of reality they've created. And we all have elements of this as we create narratives to live with parts of ourselves we're unsure of, performing independence or popularity or being loved online and in real life. Maybe if we treated our inner world as being more sacred, then we would be happier, that we shouldn't expect or pretend to give people a direct view into each corner of our lives, and by doing so, we're taking away from the simpler joys in life and the things that matter. Through the dramatization of his own death, Bob Fosse shows the effects of losing yourself to the performance, a person motivated by fear in his presentation of himself, a fear that he wouldn't live up to his own image, which led him to become consumed by it, existing only as a hollowed-out stage version of Joe Gideon, leaving nothing behind but his work and the people who tried to be loved by him. And as we watch his final performance, it leaves us with this question. Do you have conviction in the part you're playing? Does anyone? Do I?